Hey folks, my name is Nils Andreassen and I'm the Executive Director of the Alaska Municipal League. Really pleased to be presenting today and hosting this course overall. Thinking today about asset management as we are working towards strengthening capacity in our local governments. I want to pause and have us all think about the historical context. What are the circumstances, decisions, priorities, planning that went into the infrastructure that we have today? And how do we make sure that we're thinking about and building on that experience into the future? To start, let's think about where we're at. Right now, Alaska's infrastructure report card, which will be updated soon, but the 2021 report talks about Alaska overall receiving a C- as a grade. That's speaking about infrastructure from a statewide perspective with all the different jurisdictions and authorities in place who are responsible for that infrastructure. We know that when it comes to local governments, we're not responsible for all the things. This is from a statewide perspective. So how would you grade the infrastructure in your community? And if these are scores at a statewide level, would you be above or below? When we're thinking about today's infrastructure, we know that water and wastewater systems are struggling almost across the board. We still have communities without water and wastewater. And we know that the lack of in-home water and sewer services has serious health implications. But for local governments, there's a wide range of pretty significant issues that these systems are working to address. We could think about transportation, and one of the big infrastructure assets that local governments have to manage are ports and harbors. We also, for our coastal communities, many of them depend on the Alaska Marine Highway System. Aging infrastructure of our ports and harbors hurts the local economy, hurts residents, and makes it more difficult overall to achieve the living conditions that we want to see in our communities. When it comes to energy, power, and heating, a wide range of fuel sources that are used by communities, many local governments with municipal utilities that they're responsible for, or who work closely with the cooperative or other type of utility in the community, ultimately wanting to make sure that generation, distribution, and so on is occurring correctly and affordably, considering ways for renewables to be integrated, addressing things like bulk fuel, and overall making sure that maintenance is occurring. If that's the current, a long probably list of issues that you're dealing with on the ground, if we step back and think about how we got here, there's probably a couple different decades that stand out for you. And this isn't perfect. And I would say, too, it's worth you thinking about from your community, what are the historical decision-making processes that got you to where you're at? And it's always an interesting process trying to describe Alaska's history for everybody. To keep it short and sweet, we're thinking about kind of pre-statehood really being very resource focused. We know that the Alaska Highway was completed prior to statehood. And that connection to the U.S. was really about accessing some of those resources, the same as the reason to start developing the Alaska Railroad. When Alaska became a state, that coincided with thinking about lands and resources really concretely. And ultimately, it's the infrastructure that resource development would depend on that affected some of the conditions that we experience today. Had lots of kind of standout events in our history. The Good Friday earthquake led to incredible damage, but also pretty massive rebuilding efforts and a flood of federal and other funding to improve our communities. The Alaska Permanent Fund was established once Prudhoe Bay kicked off. We wanted to preserve our oil revenues into the future. TAPS was constructed, and transportation and access along that route during those decades. In the 1980s, the state went through a couple of different transitions from highs and to lows when it came to revenue. The state acquired the railroad, which enhanced its control over transportation infrastructure, but declining oil prices led to really stressed communities and a stressed state. I don't want to say luckily, but the Exxon Valdez oil spill at the end of the 80s had not only had long-lasting environmental impacts, but also, again, a pretty significant inflow of federal and other types of funding that communities were able to leverage. In the 1990s, I think we moved away from a resource-dependent economy to something that felt more diverse. Population kind of stabilized and increased in the decades since, even though today we're experiencing some net outmigration. Tourism became another leg of the stool for Alaska's economy. It was during this period that the state transferred to local governments almost all of the port and harbor assets that were there. And for a state with more coastline than the rest of the U.S. put together, that's significant. And I would argue that remains underinvested in by the state. More recent years has meant investments in renewable energy, modernization of some of our infrastructure, to some extent, some expansion of that transportation infrastructure, and importantly, broadband networks, even as new challenges emerge, and especially as it relates to climate change. And when we're thinking about permafrost or extreme weather events or sea ice reduction, all of these things have led to new ways of thinking about infrastructure. More recently, we've seen pretty dramatic state spending cuts. It was about 6 years ago when we saw significant funding reductions that across the board disrupted local governments, not just in their operations and job security, but when it came to thinking about deferred maintenance and capital improvements and so on. The state was not the partner at that time that it had been in the past. And reductions meant that everybody can tighten their belts. It's worth noting that some of the base funding that local governments receive, things like the Community Assistance Program, now is just at about 16% of its 1985 level once you adjust for inflation. And that has corresponding impacts on purchasing power. When community assistance was reduced to zero, we saw communities closing their doors. So we have to think about not just what have local governments inherited over that history, but what are the current fiscal conditions that maybe local governments still haven't adapted to it? The state's not the partner in providing the funding that it has in the past. Where do we go? That strain has been felt, especially, I think we've heard arguments related to public education, school infrastructure, especially when we point to about a $2.3 billion backlog of school construction and major maintenance needs, and it has a direct impact on local governments. So the state spending cuts that we've experienced in recent years kind of lead to all these other repercussions that we have to deal with. A bright note, new federal infrastructure support has meant billions of dollars pushed into Alaska. I think we estimate roughly $3 billion a year coming into the state for transportation and energy and power, for resilience improvements and broadband and water and sewer. And we want to make the most of those investments. It's also worth recognizing that's not going to be everything, and there will remain challenges that we have to address. And together, I think, get a lot better at how we manage the infrastructure that we've got, how we think about improvements to that infrastructure, replacing these assets, and how do we make sure that for the long term, we've got systems in place that complement and support the work that we want to do. I hope you'll each spend some time thinking about what does your community's history look like when it comes to the infrastructure that you're managing today. And if there's anything that AML can do to support you, hopefully this is one small step. But we want to be a partner as you think about what it takes to strengthen Alaska's local governments. Thank you.